Taiwan moved this morning, not with a declaration of independence, not with a missile launch, not with a dramatic announcement aimed at Beijing. It moved with tanks on public roads, armored vehicles on highways, and units shifting from routine posture into what Taiwan calls immediate combat readiness. For 5 days, Taiwan's armed forces are rehearsing a question that may decide the future of the Pacific. What happens if a Chinese drill stops being a drill? That is the scenario. Because China does not need to announce an invasion for Taiwan to face a crisis. It can begin with aircraft, naval patrols, Coast Guard ships, drones, cyber pressure, a blockade, a so-called exercise that becomes something harder to reverse with every hour that passes. And that is why this week's exercise matters. Taiwan is not training for a movie-style invasion where every warning is obvious and every line on the map is clear. It is training for the much more dangerous possibility, the moment when normal pressure becomes a real operation before the outside world has agreed on what it is seeing. At the same time, the United States has spent months focused on the war with Iran. American missile defenses have been used. Long-range weapons have been fired. Defense manufacturers are under pressure to expand output. And there is now an open argument in Washington over whether America has enough high-end munitions for every crisis it says it is prepared to handle. That argument matters in Taiwan, not because China needs America to be weak, and not because Taiwan is waiting helplessly for someone else, but because deterrence depends on a simple calculation. If a crisis begins in the Taiwan Strait, how quickly can Taiwan respond? How quickly can the United States move? How much can Washington sustain? And how sure can Beijing be that a distraction somewhere else has changed the answer? This is not a prediction that China will attack tomorrow. It is something more serious. It is the possibility that China is watching, learning, and waiting for a moment when the costs of action look lower than they did before. I call this the distracted superpower window. A window is not an invasion plan. It is not a timetable. It is not a guarantee of war. It is a moment when one power sees another power spending attention, weapons, money, and political capital somewhere else, and then begins asking a different question. Not, can we win? But would they still be ready? Today, we are going to break down why Taiwan's new drills are different, what China is likely learning from America's war in Iran, why the munitions debate is bigger than one arms sale, and why the next Taiwan crisis may not begin with a Chinese invasion fleet. It may begin with an exercise that no one knows how to stop. To understand the danger, you have to understand what Taiwan is actually training for. For years, military exercises were often treated as scheduled events. Units prepared, cameras arrived, timetables were known. Everyone understood where the performance began and where it ended. Taiwan is moving away from that model. Its Immediate Combat Readiness Exercise is built around a faster transition from peacetime into wartime conditions. The goal is not simply to show equipment. It is to test whether commanders, troops, logistics, and communications can react quickly when the warning is incomplete. That is a direct response to the way China applies pressure. Beijing's military presence around Taiwan has become routine. Aircraft operate near the island, naval vessels move through nearby waters, long-range training flights take place in the wider Pacific. The pressure is designed to feel normal enough that every new movement looks like another day. And that is the problem. When pressure becomes normal, the first hours of a real crisis become harder to identify. China does not have to begin with a landing. It could begin with inspections, a Coast Guard exclusion zone, a maritime safety operation, a live fire warning area, an air or sea exercise that interrupts commercial traffic, a cyber attack blamed on unknown actors, or an order that ships must change course for their own protection. Each step could be presented as temporary. Each step could be defended as defensive. And each step could force Taiwan, the United States, Japan, and other partners to decide whether they are responding to an exercise or to the opening move of something much larger. That is why Taiwan is practicing mobility. Armored vehicles on roads are not simply a display of strength. They are a test of movement through a civilian environment. They test how quickly forces can disperse, relocate, protect key sites, and avoid being caught in fixed positions. Taiwan has also been testing U.S.-supplied HIMARS launchers and running coastal defense drills designed around countering a possible amphibious assault. The strategy is not to mirror China's size. Taiwan cannot do that. The strategy is to make an attack or blockade expensive, slow, unpredictable, and politically dangerous. That means mobile rockets, anti-ship missiles, drones, decentralized command, dispersed supplies, rapid mobilization, and the ability to keep fighting after the first strike. This is not glamorous. It is not about a single decisive battle. It is about denying China the quick victory that any attacker would need. And this is where the timing becomes uncomfortable. Taiwan is training for the exact kind of sudden transition that China has spent years making more plausible, while America is debating how much of its own military capacity has been absorbed by Iran. So the next question is unavoidable. What does Beijing learn when it watches the United States fight a long, expensive war far from the Pacific? The answer begins with ammunition. A war between the United States and China would not be decided by one speech, one carrier group, or one dramatic airstrike. It would be decided by stocks, missiles, interceptors, precision-guided weapons, spare parts, fuel, repair capacity, production lines, and the ability to replace losses faster than they occur. That is why the Iran war matters, even if the next crisis is in the Pacific. The same American defense industrial base must support multiple commitments at once: air defense in the Middle East, deterrence in Asia, support for allies, rebuilding inventories, long-range strike capacity, training, maintenance, and the daily burden of keeping forces ready. The public debate in Washington has been messy because the facts point in two directions at once. Some officials insist that the United States remains fully capable and has enough munitions for any likely contingency. Other officials, lawmakers, and defense analysts warn that the Iran war exposed a deeper problem that already existed. America did not enter this conflict with unlimited stocks, especially for a long, high-intensity fight. That distinction matters. The problem is not that the United States has run out. It has not. The problem is that high-end munitions are not like money in a digital account. You cannot create more of them overnight. A Patriot interceptor can take time to build. A Tomahawk cannot be replaced by a press conference. A long-range anti-ship missile is not produced at the pace of a consumer product. And in a Pacific conflict, the demand would be enormous. China has major missile forces, a massive shipbuilding base, and the geographic advantage of fighting close to its own coast. The United States would be operating across vast distances, dependent on bases, logistics, alliances, and access routes that could all be under pressure. This is why Taiwan matters so much. Taiwan's strategy assumes it must hold on, not forever, not alone, but long enough to make a quick Chinese success impossible. That means the island needs weapons that can survive the first wave, fire from concealed positions, and keep creating costs after the headlines move on. And that is exactly why the debate over a reported arms package for Taiwan has become symbolic. There were reports that a proposed U.S. package could be delayed or paused because of munitions concerns tied to Iran. Other U.S. sources disputed that link and said arms sale timelines are shaped by a much longer process. Both points can be true in a broader sense. One delayed package does not decide Taiwan's future, but a system stretched across several crises does send a message. The message is not America is absent. The message is that American power has limits, trade-offs, and production constraints. China has always known that. The question is whether Beijing now believes those constraints are becoming more visible. Because deterrence is not only about what a country owns, it is about what its opponent believes it can use, replace, and sustain. And that brings us to the most important Chinese calculation of all. China does not have to beat America in every category. It only has to create a crisis too fast, too ambiguous, and too costly for America to answer cleanly. This is why the biggest risk around Taiwan may not be a classic invasion. An invasion is visible, troops assemble, ships mass, supply lines form, satellites see it, markets panic, governments prepare. A blockade or gray zone operation is different. It can begin below the threshold that normally triggers a military response. China can use its Coast Guard, its maritime militia, its navy, its air force, its legal claims, its trade leverage, its cyber capabilities, its information campaigns. The objective would not necessarily be to seize Taiwan in a week. It could be to make Taiwan's normal life feel conditional, to make shipping uncertain, to make insurers nervous, to make companies reroute cargo, to make airlines adjust schedules, to make foreign governments argue about what counts as an act of war. And while everyone argues, the pressure accumulates. That is the playbook Taiwan is increasingly preparing for. Its current exercises are designed around the possibility that Chinese military activity can shift quickly from routine operations into a real crisis. In other words, Taiwan is not just training to fight an invasion, it is training to recognize the moment before an invasion, or blockade, becomes irreversible. This is where America's distraction becomes relevant. A distracted superpower window does not mean China suddenly becomes all-powerful. It means the political and military environment may become more favorable for coercion. If the United States is managing an Iran ceasefire, rebuilding missile stocks, supporting allies in other theaters, and arguing at home about costs, Beijing may see more room to test boundaries. Not necessarily with an attack. With pressure. A new inspection regime, a declared exercise zone, a temporary closure, a demand for ships to register, a challenge to an aircraft route. A Coast Guard operation that forces a response. Each move asks the same question: will Washington escalate over this? And if Washington does not, the next step becomes easier. That is why Taiwan's defense strategy has become increasingly focused on resilience. The island is building a larger anti-ship missile force. It is emphasizing mobility, dispersed operations, drones, and systems that can keep functioning after communications and infrastructure are hit. The idea is simple. Do not give China one target. Do not rely on one command center. Do not expect one warning, and do not make defense depend on a perfect American response in the first hour. That last part is crucial. Taiwan is preparing to fight with allies, but it is also preparing for delay. Delay in information, delay in political decisions, delay in foreign military movement, delay in weapons deliveries, delay in international agreement over what is happening. The real test is whether Taiwan can turn that delay into time. Time for the world to see the crisis. Time for allies to respond. Time for China to face rising costs. Time for a temporary operation to become too risky to continue. That is the logic behind the new drills. Taiwan is not training because war is inevitable. It is training because ambiguity is dangerous, and ambiguity is exactly where China is strongest. Now here is the argument from the other side. China would say this entire framing is manufactured by Washington and Taipei. Beijing insists Taiwan is part of China, rejects what it calls separatist activity, and describes its military operations as a response to provocation and foreign interference. From Beijing's perspective, U.S. arms sales, political visits, and military cooperation are the destabilizing factors. China says it wants reunification, and it has repeatedly stated that it will not renounce the use of force. Taiwan rejects that claim. Taipei says its future must be decided by its own people, and argues that China's daily military pressure is designed to force submission without a formal declaration of war. These positions are not going to disappear. That is why the danger is structural. The Taiwan Strait is not tense because one side misunderstood a single event. It is tense because each side believes time may be working against it. China sees a Taiwan that is strengthening ties with the United States, building more asymmetric weapons, and creating a harder military problem. Taiwan sees a China that is modernizing faster, operating closer, and making gray zone pressure feel normal. The United States sees a test of credibility. If it cannot deter coercion against Taiwan, allies throughout Asia will question what American commitments really mean. And America's allies see a different problem. They need the United States to remain present, but they also know a war over Taiwan would be extraordinarily costly. That creates the pressure point. No one wants a war, but every side is preparing for a situation in which the other side miscalculates. The most dangerous miscalculation would be this: China believes America is too distracted to respond. America believes China is only signaling. Taiwan believes there will be more warning than there really is. And everyone discovers too late that a temporary operation has crossed into a new reality. This is why Taiwan's military shift matters more than the images of tanks on the road. Those images tell us Taiwan is trying to change its response time. It is trying to reduce the gap between warning and action. It is trying to make every Chinese move face a more immediate, more distributed, and more unpredictable defense. Taiwan is also expanding the tools designed to complicate a maritime operation. Its stated plans include a much larger stock of anti-ship missiles in the coming years, a sign that Taipei expects the sea, not just the beach, to be the first battlefield. That creates a harsh equation for China. The closer China gets to Taiwan, the more firepower it may have to absorb. The longer China keeps pressure below the level of war, the more Taiwan can learn and adapt, and the more China delays, the more complicated the military problem becomes. That does not make Taiwan safe. But deterrence is not about safety. It is about making the other side doubt that force will produce a fast, controllable result. And that is the real contest unfolding now. Not simply China versus Taiwan, but preparation versus uncertainty. And that brings us to what matters most in the next days and weeks. So what should you watch now? First, watch the pattern of Chinese activity around Taiwan, not just the raw number of aircraft or ships. Watch the type of activity. Are the operations routine? Are they moving farther into the Pacific? Are Coast Guard and naval units appearing together? Are there declared exercise zones near commercial routes? Are drones, surveillance aircraft, or refueling aircraft being used in ways that suggest endurance rather than symbolism? The pattern tells you more than any single headline. Second, watch what happens after Taiwan's 5-day readiness exercise ends. Does Taiwan return to the old model of scheduled drills? Or does it keep expanding real-time mobilization, decentralization, and rapid movement through civilian areas? The more Taiwan normalizes this kind of training, the harder it becomes for China to rely on surprise. Third, watch the U.S. arms package and the wider production debate. The most important indicator is not one announcement. It is whether Washington converts concern into contracts, production capacity, stockpile rebuilding, and faster delivery. Deterrence is built in factories as much as it is built on aircraft carriers. Fourth, watch Japan, the Philippines, Australia, and other regional partners. A Taiwan crisis would not happen in isolation. Access, basing, intelligence, logistics, and political support from allies would shape every American decision. The more those relationships become visible and prepared, the less attractive coercion becomes. And finally, watch language. When Beijing talks about routine exercises, inspections, law enforcement, or security zones, listen closely. Those words can describe ordinary activity, but in a crisis they can also be the vocabulary of gradual escalation. That is why Taiwan is rehearsing the transition. Because the first warning may not sound like a warning. It may sound like a temporary measure, a safety notice, a navigation restriction, a law enforcement action, a drill. And by the time the world decides what it really is, the facts on the water may already have changed. This is the distracted superpower window. It does not mean America has abandoned Taiwan. It does not mean China has decided on war. And it does not mean Taiwan is powerless. It means every actor is watching whether the balance of attention, ammunition, readiness, and political will is shifting. China is watching how America fights in Iran. Taiwan is watching how China turns routine pressure into strategic leverage, and Washington is being forced to confront a question that gets harder every year. Can it deter a crisis in the Pacific while managing wars and commitments everywhere else? Because the next Taiwan crisis may not begin with an invasion. It may begin with an exercise. And the moment that exercise becomes something else, the world may have far less time to react than it thinks.